Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today is this month's patron pick. Thank you so much to all of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The topic that won this month's voting was the rules governing player communication. This is a very important topic because it forms the backbone of Magic's communication policy. Pretty much every game of imperfect information has some degree of bluffing, but especially in a game of Magic, which involves so many moving parts, many of which exist only in the players' minds, it's necessary to have some limits on what players can bluff or otherwise represent. This topic also tends to be a bit controversial since different games have different rules for what separates a legitimate, if not particularly sportsmanlike bluff from an outright cheat. Magic has a long history, and without knowing the background behind certain aspects of this policy, they might seem arcane or downright unfair, so I'll do my best to explain the reasons behind some of the more controversial aspects as they come up. Ready? Let's get started. There are 4 different categories of information in Magic. Whether you can bluff or outright lie about something in the game depends on what kind of information that you're talking about. The first category is status information, which consists of basic information about what the game state is. Status information consists of life total, any counters a player has, such as poison, energy, rad counters, and even tickets, what unspent mana is in your mana pool, and a few mechanic-specific items, namely your location in a dungeon and how many times the ring has tempted you. Continuous effects that apply to a player and have no defined expiration are also status information. This would include mechanic-specific stuff like whether you have the city's blessing and which player is the monarch or has the initiative. It also applies to things like Stigma Lasher, making it so you cannot gain life, and Praetor's Counsel, removing your max hand size. Status information has the highest standard as far as how honest you have to be. Not only do you have to always answer any questions about it fully and correctly, you also need to announce each time it changes and have some physical method for tracking which is visible to both players. A shared method is acceptable as long as everyone can access it. Now, officially, you cannot use a method that's easy to accidentally change to track status information at competitive professional rules enforcement level. The MTR specifically calls out dice as something you should not use for this purpose. That said, from a practical perspective, this rule is rarely enforced. Life totals are one thing. I think even at regular rel, I see most people tracking life on pen and paper or with a boogie board. Dice are occasionally used, but at least in my area, it's a bit of a rarity. Using dice for poison, on the other hand, is a bit more common. I mean, you could track it on a life pad just the same, but in practice the fact that you only need to go up to 10, and the fact that people aren't used to separately tracking poison every game unless you're playing a deck that uses that mechanic, mean a lot of people use dice, potentially in concert with one of those poison tokens from their opponent to track this. Energy has all the same factors working for it, but maybe a bit stronger. Unspent mana, when applicable, is almost always acknowledged only verbally, except in cases where a combo player is going off on a long and complicated turn. Even then, in my experience, using dice to represent what mana of what color is available is the norm, while using a pen and paper is considered too cumbersome. Finally, I'm not sure if literally anybody has ever used anything other than a die or counter on the appropriate reference card to represent their location in a dungeon or how many times the ring has tempted them. So, is it a problem that the common practice for all of these goes against what the official policy says? Well, yes and no. I'm not going to try and say that bumping the table has never caused a die to go from one room of a dungeon to the next, or changed how many poison counters someone had. But there's always trade-offs. If the game state is clear to both players in the vast majority of cases, it's hard to say that something needs to change, especially if the alternative is noticeably more of a burden on the players. That philosophy is borne out by the official policy too. There isn't really a penalty for breaking this rule, and as a judge, I don't see a reason to make a big deal out of it unless you can see something becoming problematic. Now, the next class of information is free information. Like status information, free information generally represents publicly available information about the game state or the tournament, and it's not allowed for players to lie or mislead their opponents when dealing with information of this type. Unlike status information, it's not required for players to supply their opponents with free information anytime it changes. But if an opponent asks you for free information, you cannot refuse to answer or omit relevant details. And that's reasonable. There are things that just don't make sense to be able to bluff about. For example, what step or phase it is in the current turn, which player is active, and how many games each player has won in the current match are all free information. So is the state and current zone of any game object. This includes things like whether a creature is tapped or untapped, and what permanent, if any, an aura or equipment is attached to. Likewise, the number and type of counters on any permanent is free information. This is in contrast to the number of counters on a player, which is, as noted before, status information. The name of any visible object is free information. This has the consequence that it's always possible to obtain the oracle text of any card, even if it's in a foreign language or a cringy, illegible version of it. Any public details about what actions a player is taking in the game are free information. For example, if a player was casting Cabal Therapy, the target of that spell would be free information, as would whether the player was casting from their hand or flashing it back, as well as how its costs were paid. Other examples would include whether a player was scrying a card to the top or bottom of their library. Past game actions that still affect the game state are also free information. So if there was a fire ice on the stack, knowing which half was cast would be free information. Or if a player had some cards that were exiled via normal means and some cards that were exiled via experimental synthesizer, it would be free information to know which was which. Or if one of Amy's creatures had been affected by a giant growth earlier in the turn, it would be free information to know what creature that was. Next up is derived information. This is information that all players are entitled access to, but it might require some sort of skill or calculation to determine. You may not make false statements about derived information, but if an opponent asks, you are not obligated to assist in determining it. This means it is allowed for you to refuse to answer or to give a true yet unhelpful or incomplete answer. On the other hand, you may not attempt to obstruct an opponent's ability to determine derived information for themselves. There are fewer types of things that are categorized as derived information than the other types that we've looked at so far, but they require a little bit more explanation. For example, the number of any kind of objects present in any game zone is derived information unless it is already defined as free information. So if you had some cards in the exile zone, how many cards were there would be derived information. But if you exile them with Apex of Power, then that would be a past game action that affects the current game state, so it would instead be free information. Here's another example. Amy asks Nick if he has any blue cards in hand. Nick says he doesn't. Amy then plays a show and tell. Nick responds by playing Force of Will against the show and tell by pitching Jace the Mind Sculptor. Amy calls a judge and says that Nick just lied about the number of blue cards in his hand. In other words, he gave inaccurate information about the number of a kind of object in a game zone. Is what Nick did against the rules? And fortunately for sane players everywhere, the answer is that no, Nick did not do anything illegal here. The reasoning is a little bit technical, though. The term object in that line in the MTR actually has a special game definition given in the comprehensive rules. An object is an ability on the stack, a card, a copy of a card, a token, a spell, a permanent, or an emblem. So based on that definition, blue cards is not a kind of object. Cards is a kind of object. Blue cards is a kind of object that has a specific value for one of its characteristics, which is not derived information. It's private information, which, and this is a bit of a spoiler here, is the only type of information that you are allowed to outright lie about. It's also a nice segue into the next type of derived information. The characteristics of any object that's in a public zone is considered derived information. Again, unless such characteristics were already otherwise defined as free or status information. For example, the name of an object is one of its characteristics, but we already know that the name of any visible object is free information. Like before, characteristic is a game term that has a specific definition. An object's characteristics are its name, mana cost, color, color indicator, card type, subtype, super type, rules text, abilities, power, toughness, loyalty, defense, hand modifier, and life modifier. Those last two probably are not familiar to you unless you've played Momer Vig Basic or some other format involving vanguards. Now, one thing you might have noticed is that a card's owner or controller is not a characteristic. In practice, this doesn't matter much because anytime something like that would be in question, the answer would readily be apparent given the details of some past game actions which still affect the game state, which is free information. And there's one last category of derived information, which is any information about the game rules, tournament policy, oracle text of cards, or official information pertaining to the tournament. For these purposes, cards are considered to have their oracle text printed on them. This seems like a reasonable idea since it means that if someone asks you what a card does, then it isn't an infraction to answer by showing it to them, even if the card has had errata, from, for example, a summon Lord of Atlantis to a creature merfolk. One consequence of this, though, is that if a card has some more substantive errata, it is not required for your opponent to point this out. A prominent example of this would be Howling Mine. The modern versions of this card say that it only works as long as Howling Mine is untapped. Up until the 6th edition rules changed, though, that was how all artifacts worked. So earlier versions of this card omitted this text because it was just a simple fact of the game rules. It is not legal to take advantage of this ambiguity to give yourself a trigger that you wouldn't normally get, but at the same time, there's nothing against the rules about not telling your opponent about any relevant errata when they ask what a card does. I'll concede that this does open up the door for some undesirable outcomes, but bear in mind that very many Magic cards have had some sort of errata, whether it be an updated creature type, a change in the template, such as saying exile rather than remove from the game, or a change to adapt the card to modern rules. It's tough to quantify exactly what errata is relevant enough that it ought to be brought up, and until someone comes up with a better way, the safest policy is to look up the Oracle text for yourself anytime an opponent plays a card that you are unfamiliar with. And that wraps it up for derived information. The last category is the simplest one to describe. Private information is information a player only has access to if they can determine it from the current visible game state or their record of previous game actions. Any information not otherwise classified as status, free, or derived information is considered private. And that's it. With these rules, you can classify any type of information into one of those 4 categories. This means that we're ready to talk about the rules of player communication. The whole purpose of this setup, where we have 4 different categories of information, is that each category has its own rules around how that information may be communicated. For status information, players must announce any changes in their status information, and they must use something physical to represent it. Anytime a player notices a discrepancy in recorded or announced status information, that player must call attention to it right away. With regards to free information, players must answer completely and honestly any question of this type, but they need not proactively volunteer this information anytime it changes, just when asked about it. Anytime you do communicate free information, you cannot do so incorrectly or misleadingly. For derived information, players can communicate this in an incomplete, misleading, or unhelpful manner, including refusing to answer questions of this type. Any communication does need to be accurate, though, if only technically so. Finally, there are no rules regarding communication about private information to your opponent. You can be truthful, misleading, or downright false in anything you say about private information. You can choose to answer questions about it or refuse, according to your will. In addition to this, at regular rules enforcement level, all derived information is instead considered to be free, and therefore subject to all the normal rules for free information. This is in keeping with the intention that regular relevants have a more laid-back atmosphere. Discouraging players from trying to mislead or quibble their opponents into misplaying is probably for the best in an environment where newer players are expected. By the way, maybe you noticed how I always used the word communicate rather than said. There's no reason that this communication has to be verbal. The rules apply for nonverbal communication just the same. For example, let's say Amy played a Thoughtseize against Nick and he had one of those cards that's a land on the back face and a creature on the front. Nick is using a substitute card and he puts it into the pile with all the rest of his lands from his hand, putting the non-land cards into another pile. I think there's a pretty strong case that Nick has committed at least a communication policy violation here. Even if he didn't say a single word, he pretty clearly represented that his modal double-faced card was a land and therefore not eligible to be taken with the Thoughtseize, even though that's not correct. Since the characteristics, card type in this case, of any visible object are derived information, it is not allowed for Nick to represent these incorrectly. Finally, when you're talking to a judge, everything is free information. Hopefully that shouldn't come as a surprise, but you are not allowed to bluff a judge. The people in charge of providing fair resolutions when things go wrong need full and accurate information about what happened in order to render those decisions. This does not include questions like, where do you live or what's your phone number, that have nothing to do with a judge doing their job. In fact, if a judge makes a serious attempt to get you to answer some sort of inappropriate question, this sort of thing can and should be reported to the tournament organizer. But one thing that a judge does have a legitimate right to ask that may throw some people off is a question like, what was your game plan when you made that play? Questions about a player's intentions or state of mind can be an important context for an investigation and should be answered honestly. Of course, the other player in the game has no right to such information, so the judge should ask these questions away from the table. As a player, you can also request that your conversation with the judge take place away from the table in case you're worried about talking in front of your opponent for any reason. Speaking of judges, we have rules too. Judges will happily help players to determine free and status information, but cannot assist players with derived information about the game state. This is a common point of frustration for players and judges. Here's a classic example. Let's say a player plays a batter skull while there's a humility out and asks how big the germ token is. Because power and toughness are derived information, officially a judge should not answer this question directly. I could tell you that the humility applies first, but the actual calculating of the power and the toughness should be left to the player because that's derived information. And those are the rules that govern player communication. Maybe you're curious about what would happen if someone broke those rules. Well, the short answer is that at regular rel, a judge would probably advise the player why what they did was wrong and fix the game state as best as they could. At competitive rel, breaches of the communication policy are an infraction called a communication policy violation. The normal penalty is a warning, but in order to be considered a communication policy violation, the player needs to have taken a game action or decided not to take a game action based on the erroneously communicated information. A CPV that doesn't lead to the opponent playing any different is no infraction, but probably would warrant a judge jumping in to explain the issue and counsel the player not to do it again. If the judge determines that a CPV has been committed, a backup to the point where the player acted on the erroneous information may be performed. The judge might also rule that the game should continue with no fix if backing up this way would be too disruptive. I talked a lot more about what goes into this sort of decision on my video about backing up, so I'll refer you there if you'd like more information about this topic. Now let's try out some challenge questions to test your understanding. First up, here's one that happens pretty regularly. Amy asks Nick how many cards he has in hand. Does Nick have to answer? And for this, we'll recall that the number of objects in a game zone is derived information. Nick can decline to answer, but he cannot answer inaccurately nor impede Amy from determining the answer herself. In practice, most people will answer a question like this as a matter of etiquette, since this question can come up multiple times for each player in a match, and making the other player count typically takes more time than just answering plainly. The power and toughness of a Tarmogoyf or similar follows the same rules and is usually handled the same way by players. What about this? Amy attacks with a 2/2 lifelinker and forgets to gain 2 life when it deals damage. Later, Nick attacks her for 2, and Amy says, go to 18. Nick scratches out the 22 on his life pad under Amy's name and says, yup. What is the appropriate infraction, penalty, and fix? And this sort of interaction, or variance of it, is actually very common. Amy forgot to gain 2, so in her mind, her life total didn't change. Nick isn't responsible for calling out changes to Amy's life total, but he still could have realized that something was up when Amy didn't do that herself. On the other hand, when Nick attacks back, Amy's life total definitely does change, and Nick is obligated to bring up any discrepancy he notices right away because life totals are status information. This is at least a CPV for Nick, and the judge is probably going to ask him some rather uncomfortable questions about whether he knew it was against the rules to let your opponent ignore lifelink, which, if he did, Nick would be guilty of cheating. Bonus points if Nick usually strikes out life changes with a single line, but made a special effort to completely scribble out the 22 for this one. Judges love it when someone tries to bury evidence. It's a pretty strong sign that they knew they were doing something wrong, and it makes it a lot easier to pull the trigger on a DQ. Next up is one longtime fans of the channel may remember. Amy casts Slaughter games against Nick and names Jace the Mind Sculptor. She starts searching through Nick's library and exiles 1, 2, 3 copies. As she's exiling the third, Nick says, I only play 3. So Amy gives Nick his deck back and he shuffles. A few turns later, Nick plays Jace the Mind Sculptor. Turns out, he lied about how many he was playing because it's a key card in the matchup and he wanted to try and keep one. Is this legitimate? Well, let's imagine that Amy and Nick are just playing, and Amy asks Nick how many copies of Jace he's playing while she's deciding what to name for Slaughter games. I think it should be pretty uncontroversial to say that Nick would definitely be allowed to lie here, right? Amy shouldn't have any reason to expect that Nick would tell her the right answer in this case. The number of cards of a certain type in Nick's library is only accessible if you can see the library or if you can get that information from your personal records. In other words, it's private information. Now, guess what? Nothing changes about that when we're in the next step of resolving slaughter games. The library is still a hidden zone even if all the cards in it are revealed. This isn't a very sporting play from Nick, but it is allowed. If you check the comments from the last time that I covered this one, they're pretty much all comments about how unfair this ruling is and how the policy should change. Okay, great. Comment below specifically what you would change to make what Nick did against the rules. It's actually pretty difficult to do in a way that still allows people to bluff, but doesn't break some other part of the policy even worse. Okay, what about this? Amy asks Nick how many untapped creatures he has. Nick says that he has a 2/2 and a 2/3 flyer. Amy attacks with a 5/5. Nick blocks with Vampire Nighthawk and says it trades with Amy's creature since it has Death Touch. Amy calls the judge and says that she didn't know that Nick's creature had Death Touch, and if she did, she wouldn't have attacked. How do you rule? And the answer is that Nick's play here is 100% legitimate. How many untapped creatures Nick controls on the battlefield would fall under derived information, since it's a combination of the number of objects in a game zone and the characteristics of objects in a public zone. This being the case, Nick is allowed to make incomplete statements about it, but not false statements. Vampire Nighthawk is indeed a 2/3 flyer, it just also has lifelink and Death Touch. It's also a vampire. Now, what about if Amy asks Nick how many blockers he has, and Nick responds, I don't have to answer that. Amy looks at Nick's side of the battlefield for a bit, and then attacks with a 3/1. Nick then reaches towards his lands and pulls out a Dryad Arbor from his stack of forests, moving to block with it. Amy then calls for a judge and says that she would not have attacked if she realized Nick had this 1/1. How do you rule? Well, in this case, Nick is in the wrong. As before, Amy is asking for derived information, meaning that Nick was correct when he said that he did not have to answer. However, he also is not allowed to impede Amy's ability to figure it out for herself. By using a non-standard game layout, Nick has incorrectly represented that he has no creatures. Usually I and most of my colleagues don't really enforce that cards need to be in a specific spot so long as the game state is clear to both players. But in this case, it obviously wasn't. And the standards defined in the MTR are a clear-cut way to assign who's at fault in cases where it leads to confusion. I would probably rule that Nick has committed a CPV and the game should be backed up to the point where Amy was deciding which creatures to attack with. How about this? Amy plays Golden Demise when she controls 10 treasure tokens. Sometime later, she plays Vona's Hunger. Since she has sacrificed some of her treasures since then, she does not have 10 permanents anymore. So Nick goes to sacrifice a creature. Amy then says, actually I have City's Blessing, so you have to sacrifice half your creatures. Nick calls for a judge and says that Amy never said she had the City's Blessing, and if he would have known, he would have countered the Vona's Hunger. How do you rule? Well, first off, whether you have the City's Blessing is status information. That means that you need to represent it with a physical designation, and you need to announce whenever it changes. Based on the information from the problem statement, it does not seem like Amy has fulfilled this responsibility. Therefore, a CPV would be appropriate. The judge may allow for a backup so that Nick can counter the Vona's Hunger. Whew, that was a lot of information. Give yourself a big pat on the back if you were able to follow all the way to the end. With this, you should have a firm understanding of what kind of information there is in a game of Magic, what information it is or is not okay to bluff about, and what happens if a player were to go against this policy. Thank you again to all of my lovely supporters on Patreon. That's all I have for you today. How did you do? Join me again next time for another daily ruling. Until then, I hope you have a great day.